The music stopped before I did. My hands were still raised above the keys when the silence hit the room, and I felt him turn. Not heard. Felt. The way you feel a temperature change, the particular drop that comes right before something breaks. He had never looked at me. 3 years, and not once. I had made my peace with that. Or I had told myself I had, which is a different thing entirely, and I understood the difference too late, because the last clear thought I had before the floor came up to meet me was not about survival. It was this. He still doesn't know my name. If you have ever spent yourself completely on someone who never once asked what it cost you, stay. This story is yours. And if these are the stories that find the parts of you nobody else reaches, subscribe. They live here. 3 years before the floor. The estate sat at the far end of Carpenter Street like a house that had decided to stop pretending. The paint gone gray, the garden overgrown, the whole structure turned inward on itself the way old things do when they've given up on being seen. Springfield in January is a particular kind of bleak. Not dramatic. Just relentless. The Capitol Dome was barely visible through the fog that morning, and I remember thinking the city looked like a photograph that had been left out too long. I had the medical file in my bag. I had read it so many times the fold lines had gone white. The man who met me at the door was not Alaric Sanchez. He was a small, precise person named Odell Ferry, thin-wristed, careful-eyed, who took my coat without touching it and led me through hallways where the wallpaper had once been burgundy and was now the color of a bruise that had almost healed. He did not make conversation. I was grateful for that. The shadowed parlor was at the back of the house. I understood the name the moment I stepped inside. The room faced north. No direct light ever crossed its floor. I would learn this later, the way you learn the rules of a place only once you've broken one. The Bosendorfers sat at the center of it like something deposited there by a force that had since lost interest. 7 feet of black lacquer. The keys were slightly yellowed at the edges, the way old teeth are, and I ran one finger along them before I sat down, not playing, just checking. Alaric was in the chair by the fireplace. His back was to me. I had been told, in the 3 brief communications that preceded this morning, that he preferred it that way. I had been told the piece. I had been told the tempo. I had not been told anything else, and the gaps in what I had been told were large enough that I had spent 2 weeks deciding not to come, and then I came anyway because the medical file was in my bag and the numbers in it were not theoretical. I set my hands on the keys. I played the opening measure of the ethereal pulse. What happened next? I had no framework for it.
His posture changed.
That is the only way I know to say it. Not dramatically. Not the way a person moves when they hear something beautiful. More the way a room changes when someone opens a window that has been sealed all winter, a loosening, a pressure releasing that you hadn't registered as pressure until it was gone. The set of his shoulders dropped a fraction. His head lifted slightly, as if he were orienting toward something. I kept playing. The fog outside the window thinned as the morning moved. Springfield went about its business on the other side of the glass. A delivery truck on Carpenter. A woman walking a dog that kept stopping to investigate the same patch of sidewalk. The ordinary machinery of a city that did not know what was happening inside this room. I watched all of it while my hands moved through the nocturne. I had memorized it 6 weeks ago. My fingers knew it well enough by now that the knowing lived below thought, and my mind was free to go wherever it wanted. It kept going back to the medical file. 2 to 3 years with continued strain. Possibly less. I played through the second movement. The third. Somewhere in the fourth, I realized I had stopped watching the window and was watching him instead. The particular stillness of a man who has been sitting inside a feeling for a very long time and has learned not to move in case it leaves. I had seen that stillness before. Not in anyone like him. In my mother in the last weeks, when she would go quiet over her coffee in a way that meant she was somewhere I couldn't follow. I filed that comparison away. I did not examine it. The session ran 4 hours that first morning. When I finally lifted my hands from the keys, the silence came down fast, complete, like a held breath released all at once. My lungs filled, properly, fully, the way they only can when my hands are still. I breathed in the smell of the room. Old wood, the faint metallic thread of the piano strings, something underneath both of those that I couldn't name yet. Cold stone. Something older than the house. Alaric stood. He did not turn around. The third movement, he said. His voice was not what I expected.
Low. Precise.
The voice of someone who has learned to use words the way a surgeon uses instruments. Only the necessary ones. Only when required. You ran the tempo 2 beats low. I looked at the sheet music on the stand. I had brought my own pencil. I marked the measure. He left the room without another word, without turning, without acknowledging that there was a person sitting at his piano rather than a machine that had malfunctioned slightly. The door did not close hard. It closed the way doors close in houses where people have learned that sound carries. I sat there for a while after he was gone. I straightened the bench, then straightened it again, though it was already straight, and I knew it was already straight, and I did it anyway. The garden was visible through the parlor's back window. An oak tree stood at the far edge of it, enormous and bare in the January cold, its branches making the particular pattern that old trees make, not chaotic, exactly, but with the logic of something that has been growing long enough to stop explaining itself. I looked at it for a while. I can manage this, I thought. This is manageable. I picked up my pencil. I put it in my bag. I buttoned my coat. I came back the next morning. 18 months in, I had become a woman with a system. Page turns. That was the mechanism, the small, unremarkable gesture of reaching toward the sheet music stand, lifting a corner of the page, holding it. 2 minutes if I was careful. Sometimes 90 seconds. Enough for my lungs to remember they had another purpose beyond the music. I had mapped the nocturne the way you map a building you've been locked inside, methodically, without sentimentality, noting which exits were real and which ones were painted on the wall. Measure 47. The left hand drops to a single sustained note. I could lift my right. Measure 93. A rest bar. Both hands, briefly, if I moved slowly enough. Measure 118. Page turn. Always a page turn. I had not told anyone. There was no one to tell, and the telling would have required an explanation of the numbers, and the numbers were the thing I had decided not to look at anymore. My last appointment had been 14 months ago. Dr. Osei's office on South Grand, the waiting room with the outdated magazines, and the window that rattled when trucks went by. I had sat in that chair and looked at a chart and understood that knowing more would not change anything I was willing to change. So I stopped going. That is the plain truth of it. I made a calculation, and I chose the side of the scale I could live with, which is a strange phrase when you think about it too carefully, so I had learned not to. Springfield in summer is a different country from Springfield in January. The garden had come back, green and indifferent the way growing things are, needing nothing from anyone. Dorothea was full, her branches so heavy with July that they curved slightly downward, and I had taken to watching her the way you watch a person across a room who doesn't know you're looking. Not with longing, exactly. With the particular attention you give to things you cannot touch. That morning a cardinal landed on the lowest branch, brilliant red against all that green. It sat there for a moment, adjusting, then went still. I thought about the word outside. How it used to be a direction rather than a category. How I used to walk through it without noticing, the way you don't notice air until the quality of it changes. The cardinal left. I went back to the keys. The heat did something to the parlor in summer, drew the smell out of the old wood, released whatever the piano strings had been holding since winter. Not unpleasant. It had become, over 18 months, the smell of a place that was mine in the way that only confined spaces become yours, completely and without choice. When I couldn't breathe properly during a long passage, that smell was what I fixed on. The wood and the metal and the particular weight of warm air in a north-facing room. It was something to hold on to that wasn't the edge of the bench. I was at measure 93 when he came in. My hands were up. Not high, barely an inch off the keys, just enough. Just the 2 minutes. I had the page half turned and my back was straight, and my breathing was deliberate and quiet, the way I had learned to make it, and I was watching the garden window and thinking about nothing in particular when the door opened and the air in the room rearranged itself the way it always did when he entered. I knew without looking. 18 months of knowing without looking. I kept my hands where they were.
He stopped.
I heard it, the particular quality of a footstep that doesn't complete itself. Then nothing. I counted 3 seconds of nothing, which is long enough to understand the shape of a silence, and I turned my head. His face. I had seen it go gray before. In the early months, during accidental pauses, a stumbled measure, a page that stuck. It lasted less than a second each time, that grayness, before the composure came back down like a screen. But I had cataloged those moments the way I cataloged everything in this room.
Carefully.
Without letting him see that I was doing it. This time I watched it happen from the beginning. The color left his face the way light leaves a room when a cloud passes. Not dramatically, just a dimming, a flatness settling over his features like something had been turned off behind his eyes. His hands at his sides closed. Not in anger. The knuckles went white and the fingers curled, and the whole shape of it was wrong for anger. Too contained, too involuntary, the grip of a man reaching for something that isn't there. It lasted less than a second. "You stopped," he said. His voice was exactly what it always was. No variation. A fact delivered in the tone of a man who has never needed to ask for anything twice. "I was breathing," I said. A pause.
Short.
The kind that isn't really a pause, the kind that is a decision being made. "Do it while you play." I looked at him for one moment longer than I should have. Long enough to see that the color had returned, that his hands had opened, that whatever had crossed his face was already locked away somewhere I was not permitted. I picked up my pencil. I marked the measure.
He left.
The parlor went quiet again. The summer outside continued, a lawn mower somewhere down Carpenter, the distant conversation of two people I would never see. The cardinal may have come back. I didn't check. I was furious. That is the simple word for it, and I am not going to dress it up. 3 years of my lungs for a man who could not extend me 2 minutes of silence, who had just told me, without hesitation, that my breathing was an inconvenience in his day. I sat with that fury and let it be what it was, clean and sharp and entirely justified. The pencil was still in my hand. His hands had been clenched. Not in anger. I was certain of that, and the certainty was the thing I did not want because anger I could file. Anger was easy to hold at a distance, easy to label and put down. What I had seen in his hands was not anger. It was the grip of someone who is afraid of the dark and knows the light is going. I put the pencil down. I put my hands on the keys. I did not examine what I had seen. I made that choice clearly, the way you choose not to open a letter you already know the contents of. I played the opening measure of the pulse. The room filled again. I watched his empty chair across the parlor and told myself it meant nothing, that what I had cataloged was simply data, useful only as information about the terms of my employment. I told myself that with complete conviction. My hands did not shake on the keys. They never shook on the keys. That was the one mercy of the condition. The stillness required for breath was the opposite of the stillness required for music. My hands were steadiest when they were playing. My lungs paid the price for that steadiness, one measure at a time. Outside, Dorothea moved in whatever breeze found her. I turned the page at measure 118. 2 minutes. I breathed. The illness came in the night, the way things come when your body has been waiting for permission. For days. That is how long it took to understand what silence in this house actually weighs. The first morning, I woke with my chest locked, not the familiar narrowing of the cyanotic grace, which I had learned to read the way you read weather, but something layered on top of it, something wet and hot that made every inhale feel like pulling air through wool. I lay still for a while, taking inventory. Then I got up and did not go to the parlor, and that choice, the first time in 18 months I had made it, sat in the room with me like a third presence. I expected him within the hour. He did not come. By midday, I had constructed a full account of what was coming. The door, the voice, the correction delivered in that tone that made statements sound like the closing of a case. I had my response prepared. I had been preparing responses for 18 months, storing them in the place where useful things go when you know you'll need them eventually. I was ready. The house stayed quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that has a texture, the kind you get in rooms where something has been removed. The parlor was down the hall, and I could feel its emptiness the way you feel a missing tooth with your tongue, involuntarily, repeatedly unable to stop checking. I slept most of the second day. On the third, I sat in the chair by my window and watched the back garden through glass I hadn't opened in weeks. Dorothea had turned. The green was gone. The leaves had gone amber and rust, and a particular shade of yellow that only exists for about 4 days in late October before the wind takes it. She was at her most herself right then, I thought. Right at the edge of losing it all. The estate made no sound I could trace to him. Odell Ferry brought water. He set it inside the door without speaking, which was his way, and I did not ask him where Alaric was or whether anyone had been told. Asking would have meant caring about the answer, and I had decided early in this arrangement that there were doors in this house I would not try to open. The fourth day. Morning. The tray was outside my door when I woke. I nearly walked into it, ceramic clicking against the floorboard as my foot caught the edge, and I stood there in the dim hallway looking down at it for a moment that was longer than it should have been.
Broth.
A cup of tea with the bag still in it, the string looped over the rim. A folded cloth, clean, the kind you press against a fever without being told to. No note. I carried it inside and set it on the small table by the window and looked at it the way you look at something you're trying to keep at a safe distance. He needs the instrument functional. That was the clean explanation, the one I could hold without it costing me anything. Maintenance. A practical calculation made by a practical creature who required music the way other things required oxygen, and who had done the arithmetic on what 4 days of illness might extend to if left unaddressed. That was the explanation. The tea was the right temperature. Not too hot, the scalding that means someone left it too long before bringing it, not thinking about the person who would receive it. Not gone cold in transit. The particular warmth of something that has been timed, which is a small and unremarkable thing except that timing requires paying attention, and paying attention requires. I drank the broth. I sat with the cloth against my throat and watched Dorothea lose 2 leaves to a wind I couldn't hear through the glass, and I told myself the temperature of the tea meant nothing at all, and I did not cry, which took more effort than I would like to admit. I returned to the parlor on the 5th morning. My chest was still rough at the edges, not clear, not what it had been before the infection, but functional. Manageable. The word I had been living inside for 2 years. He was already in his chair. He had his back to the door, as always. As if my arrival were not worth the gesture of turning. I crossed the room without speaking, set my hands on the keys without ceremony, and played the opening measure of The Pulse. What happened in his face? I had seen it 2,000 times, and it still did something to me that I could not account for cleanly. The lines around his eyes eased. Not dramatically. A fraction. The particular way tension releases from a place that has been holding for so long it has forgotten it was holding. His shoulders dropped a half-inch, no more, and the set of his jaw loosened, and for just a moment, just that one measure, he looked like a man who had been very far away and had come back to somewhere he recognized. It still looked like relief. I kept playing. The autumn light came through the parlor's north window at a low angle that turned the dust in the air to something almost warm, and the estate settled around the sound the way it always did, and I thought about the tray, the temperature of the broth, the folded cloth. He is dependent on me in a way he has never had to name. The thought arrived plainly, without drama. Not for the first time, I had circled it before at measure 118 during the 2 minutes when I was allowed to think. But it landed differently now, with the weight of 5 days behind it. 5 days in which his world had gone dark and he had not raged and had not demanded and had left a tray outside a door with the tea at the right temperature. I have let him be. That was the part one had not let myself look at before. Not his dependence. That was simply a fact of the arrangement, written into the terms from the beginning. My part. The degree to which I had made myself indispensable not only by playing, but by continuing to play when the numbers said I shouldn't. By choosing every morning to come back. I had catalogued his cruelties for 18 months. I was thorough. I was meticulous. I had kept a running account the way a careful woman keeps accounts, because careful women know that the time may come when they need to remember clearly, without sentiment clouding the math. I had not kept an account of the other things. The way his posture changed when the music reached him. The temperature of the tea. I played through the second movement. The third. At measure 93 I lifted my hands, the familiar rest, the familiar 2 minutes, and I sat in the stillness and breathed completely, all the way down, the way you can only breathe when your hands are free. Outside, Dorothea held her last amber leaves against a gray November sky, waiting for the wind to decide. I looked at the back of his head. I looked at the sheet music. I put my hands back on the keys and told myself nothing had changed, and knew, with the particular clarity of a woman who has stopped lying to herself about small things, that something had. I kept playing anyway. The system had held for 2 years.
I want to be precise about that.
2 years of Measure 47, Measure 93, Measure 118, the architecture of survival I had built inside someone else's music. 2 years of page turns and careful breathing, and the particular discipline of a woman who has decided that management is the same thing as control. Winter came back, and the system stopped working. Not all at once. That would have been easier. A clean line, a clear before and after. Instead, it was gradual, the way erosion is gradual, the way you don't notice the ground giving until your footing is already wrong. The 2-minute intervals became 3, then 4. Then I was spending more time in the estate's small bathroom than at the piano, my hands white-knuckled around the cold edge of the sink, counting breaths the way you count money when you're not sure there's enough. The color in my fingertips had changed. I noticed it first in November. A bluish cast at the nail beds, faint, the kind of thing you could dismiss in bad light. By December, I had stopped dismissing it. I started wearing long sleeves to the parlor, not for warmth, the estate was adequately heated, but because I did not want to look at my own hands while I played, and I did not want to think about what looking at them might make me feel. I scheduled the appointment on a Tuesday, canceled it Thursday, rescheduled it for the following week, and then I sat with that rescheduled date on my phone for 5 days like a letter I'd agreed to open but kept turning face down on the table. I went on a Wednesday morning in December before the session. Dr. Osei's office still had the same rattling window. The magazines had been replaced, newer issues of the same irrelevant titles. I sat in the chair across from her desk and watched her review the chart with the particular stillness of a person who has learned to keep their face professional, and I noticed the small things. The way her pen stopped moving, the half-second pause before she turned to the next page, the careful set of her shoulders when she looked up. She looked at my hands first. I had pushed the sleeves back before coming in. There was no point in the long sleeves here. She used the word accelerated. She used the word irreversible. The space she left after those 2 words was the kind of space that has a shape, not empty, not a pause, but a volume, the exact size and weight of the word she chose not to use. I sat inside that space and kept my face arranged and nodded at the appropriate moments and asked the 2 practical questions I had prepared on the drive over, and she answered them in the careful way of a doctor who is giving you the truth in the doses she thinks you can metabolize. I thanked her. I put my sleeves back down. I drove north on South Grand in the dark because the appointment had run late, the city already doing its December thing. Lights on every porch, every window, Carpenter Street strung with the particular cheerful insistence of a season that does not adjust for circumstances. I pulled into the estate's drive and turned off the engine. 19 minutes. I know because I checked my phone at the beginning and again at the end, and the number was 19, and the reason I checked it all was that I needed something concrete to hold on to, some measurement that meant I had been present and accounted for during the time I spent sitting in a dark car outside a house that was not mine, learning how to carry a new weight. I did not cry in the car. I did not cry anywhere. I went inside. I did not tell him. I had never intended to tell him. That had never been part of any version of this I had imagined. What I had not anticipated was the specific texture of not telling, the way it would feel to sit at the Bosendorfer the following morning and play through 2 hours of The Pulse with the word irreversible living somewhere in my chest alongside everything else that already lived there. He sat in his chair with his back to me. The music filled the room. His shoulders dropped their familiar half-inch. The lines around his eyes eased. The world went colored for him. Whatever the auracoustic showed him, whatever world opened up inside the sound I made, and I watched it happen the way I had watched it 2,000 times, and I played all the way to the end of the session without stopping, and when it was over I went to the bathroom and gripped the cold sink and counted. That evening, I went to the parlor alone. No session scheduled. Alaric was in whatever part of the house he inhabited between my hours, the part one had never been invited into, the part one had never asked about because asking would have required a kind of intimacy that the arrangement had never offered. The parlor was dark except for the light coming through the back window, the December sky already black by 5, Dorothea's bare branches making their winter pattern against it. I walked to the piano. I did not sit down. I stood at the side of it and placed both palms flat on the lid, not the keys, the lid, the closed wooden surface above them, and held them there. The cold came up through the lacquer immediately. That particular cold of old wood in an underheated room, the kind that pulls the warmth from your hands faster than you expect. I pressed harder, let the chill spread up to my wrists. The estate was completely silent. I had never fully registered that silence before, not because it hadn't been there, but because I had always been making sound inside it, filling it, giving it color it didn't have on its own.
This was what it sounded like without me.
Not peaceful, not hostile. Indifferent, the way very old things are indifferent. The walls, the floor, the instrument under my palms, all of it existing in a register that didn't require my presence. I thought about the nocturne's name, the ethereal pulse. I thought about my own, the sound it makes when I press 2 fingers to my wrist in the dark, which I had been doing more often lately, an inventory, a check-in, the way you test a floorboard before you trust it with your weight. I thought about what it means that music is just rhythm made deliberate. That every piece ever written began with someone's blood moving through them at a particular pace, and they translated that into sound, and someone heard it and recognized it as their own. Every piece of music is just someone's heartbeat, made audible. The cold had moved past my wrists now, up into my forearms. I didn't pull away. Outside, Dorothea stood stripped and still in the dark. She had lost the last of the amber weeks ago. She was all structure now, the bare truth of what she was without the seasonal softening. I had always thought bare trees looked diminished. Standing there with my hands on the piano in the silence, I thought I had been wrong about that. She was not diminished. She was just finally visible. I pulled my hands from the lid. The cold came with them, settled in my palms. I went upstairs. I did not look back at the piano. In my room, I pressed my fingers to my wrist in the dark and listened, and the pulse was there, faint, a little wrong in its rhythm, but present. Still counting. Still audible. I woke at 4 in the morning and knew. Not in the way you know facts, not with evidence and reasoning, and the orderly progression of one thing following another. In the way your body knows before you do, the way it communicates in a register below language. My chest had been tight since before the alarm. Not the usual narrowing.
Deeper.
A locked quality, as if something inside had decided overnight to stop negotiating. I lay still for a while and took account. Then I got up and made the bed. I do not know why I made the bed. I had not made it with any particular care in months. It was a functional thing, covers pulled up, pillows straightened, adequate. That morning I made it slowly, smoothing each crease with the flat of my palm, tucking the corners the way my mother had shown me when I was young, and patience still felt like a virtue rather than a survival strategy. When I finished, I stood back and looked at it. It looked like a bed someone had made before leaving on a trip they weren't sure they'd return from. I dressed carefully. Long sleeves. The dark skirt I had brought to Springfield 3 years ago and rarely worn because there was nowhere to wear it. I went downstairs. The parlor in early morning has a quality that the afternoon never quite recovers, a stillness that hasn't been disturbed yet, the air holding itself in place the way held breath holds. I crossed to the Bosendorfer and stood at the keyboard and ran my fingers along the keys without pressing them, feeling each edge. The slight give of the ivory. The hairline gaps between them. I had played this instrument for 3 years. I knew its resistance the way you know the resistance of a door you've opened 10,000 times, the exact pressure required, the precise angle. I sat down. I played the opening measure. For hours. The music held. The system held too for a while, the intervals, the careful management, the architecture of survival I had been maintaining for 2 years. Measure 47. Measure 93. Measure 118. My hands knew the map. My lungs followed as far as they could. 6 hours. The morning light moved across the parlor floor in its slow winter arc. He was in his chair. He had been there since the second hour, settling into his usual position. Back straight, hands resting on the armrests, face turned toward the fireplace mantel as though the music gave him something to look at that existed beyond the physical room. I had watched him do this for 3 years. The way his attention dispersed when the sound was present, traveling out along frequencies I couldn't see, experiencing a world assembled from what my hands made. He was looking at the mantel, then the ceiling, then his own hands, which he examined with the detached curiosity of a man reviewing something that belonged to him but rarely required inspection.
He was not looking at me.
He never looked at me. 9 hours. My back had gone from aching to a dull, constant pressure I had learned to play inside of rather than against. The session logs in your body differently when you know it may be the last one. Not heavier, exactly, but more present, each measure arriving with a weight that ordinary sessions don't carry. I noticed things I had stopped noticing. The particular resonance of the middle register in this room, the way the bass strings vibrated long after the keys released, the faint reflection of the parlor window in the piano's lacquered side. Springfield was dark outside. The street lights on Carpenter had been on for hours. Somewhere past the 11th hour, the room began to move. Not the room.
Me.
It started in my peripheral vision, a slow rotation, as though the floor had decided to reorient. Then in my hands, a heaviness that wasn't fatigue, a disconnection between intention and response, my fingers arriving at keys a fraction of a second after I sent them. I kept playing. I had been keeping going through worse than this for 2 years, and the reflex of continuation was stronger than any single warning. The tempo dropped. Not from my choice. From my body's. From whatever part of a person manages function below the level of will, the part that makes decisions when the upper floors stop receiving reliable information. The nocturne slowed the way a voice slows when the throat tightens, the way a sentence trails when the speaker runs out of something to say. I heard him move. The creak of the chair. The particular sound of a person orienting, not standing, not yet just turning, the way you turn when something in the room has changed frequency. His expression when I saw it. Irritation. The reflex. The default setting of a man who had spent centuries making certain the world arranged itself to his requirements and had developed that expression in place of all the softer responses, the way calluses develop in place of all the tender skin. His mouth opened. My hands left the keys. The silence came down like a wall falling. I slid from the bench. I was aware of it happening. A strange, clear awareness, the kind that arrives when the body stops pretending everything is manageable, and I was aware of him crossing the room, not gracefully, not with any of his customary composure, just moving because his body moved before his mind issued the instruction. His arms came around me, not gently, not the way you'd hold something you'd chosen to hold, more the way you catch something that is already falling, the action of a reflex older than intention. The floor did not come up to meet me.
He was in the way.
The room was gray around us. I could tell by the quality of his face, that flatness, the color drained, the same expression I had catalogued in stolen seconds over 3 years, now sustained, unguarded, because there was nothing left to guard against. He was saying something. A name, not mine. Some other woman's name, shorter, harder-edged, a name that belonged to a different decade or a different arrangement or a different version of whatever this was. He said it twice, the same flat urgency in both syllables, as if the word could do something if repeated correctly. I opened my eyes. His face was inches from mine, gray like the room. The lines I had watched ease at the first measure of the nocturne for 3 years were pulled tight now. Not in the controlled way, not the professional composure, but in the way of a person who does not know what expression to make and has run out of alternatives. Old wool. That was what I noticed. The smell of him. Something I had never let myself register from across the parlor, but could not avoid now. Old wool and wood smoke, and beneath both of those something that had no name, something that simply meant centuries and cold, and here. Not unpleasant. Nothing I had ever let myself notice before. That's not my name, I said. 3 words. The breath I had left, spent on 3 words that were not necessary. I was barely conscious. I owed him nothing. I could have let the wrong name stand the way I had let 100 other things stand over 3 years.
I said it anyway.
He went very still. The kind of still that is not composure. The kind that arrives when a person has been stopped by something they did not see coming. Lyra. My voice was very quiet. The house was so quiet I could hear Springfield outside. Traffic on South Grand, faint, the ordinary city moving through its ordinary evening, someone's dog barking twice and then stopping. The world, continuing without me. It's Lyra. His arms did not loosen. I closed my eyes. The nocturne was gone from the room entirely. The silence had the texture of the estate without me in it, that indifferent weight. I had stood inside alone, in the dark, with my palms on the cold piano lid. Except it wasn't indifferent now. It had a shape. He was still holding on. I was conscious for more of it than he knew. Not clearly, not with the full presence of a woman sitting upright in a lit room. More the way you're conscious in the space between sleep and waking, where sound arrives before meaning does, where you understand that something is happening without being able to arrange it into sequence. I heard his voice. Low, urgent, stripped of the precision he used like armor. I heard him say something I could not make out, and then I heard him on the phone, and the phone call was short, and after it the room went quiet except for one thing.
He was listening to me.
I understood this before I could have explained how I understood it. The quality of his attention had a texture I had never felt directed my way, focused, fixed, the way it must feel to be the only visible thing in a dark room. For 3 years he had looked through the sound I made at a world I couldn't see. Now the sound was gone, and I was what was left, and he was listening to the only thing I was still doing, the irregular, inadequate percussion of staying alive. I kept doing it. It seemed important to keep doing it. The woman arrived in 40 minutes. Isadora Vance. I learned her name later. That evening, when I was upright enough to ask, and Odell Ferry told me in his careful way, the way he delivered all information, as though words were a finite resource he had budgeted for the week. She came in without announcement, which meant she had a key, which meant she was not a stranger to the estate, and the sound of her crossing the parlor floor was quick and certain, the sound of a person who has walked into emergencies before and does not waste motion. She did not greet him warmly. I know because I heard the first exchange, clipped, direct, and whatever she said to him in those first seconds, his response was silence, which was the only answer that meant he had nothing to argue with. She moved him out of the way.
He went.
She worked without narrating, which I was grateful for. Her hands were cold and efficient, and she smelled like wintergreen and something medicinal that cut through the wood smoke and wool of the room, and she spoke to me plainly. Breathe here, hold this, can you feel that? And I answered what I could answer, and let her do the rest. At some point I became aware of the silence outside the door. Not an empty silence. The particular weighted silence of a person sitting very still just beyond a threshold they have chosen not to cross. I had learned the sounds of this house over 3 years. Its creaks, its drafts, the particular way footsteps sounded on the hallway floor versus the parlor, and the silence outside the door had a location, a shape, a mass. He was on the floor. I don't know how I knew that. The angle of it, the quality of the quiet, the way a person sounds different when they're sitting on the ground versus standing, something about proximity, something about the absence of the formality that verticality requires. He was sitting on the floor of his own hallway outside a room where a woman was keeping me alive, and he was listening, and the thing he was listening for was the sound of a heartbeat that was not strong enough. I thought about the temperature of the broth. I thought about a lot of things in those hours, with the particular clarity that arrives when your body has stopped pretending it can continue indefinitely. Isadora moved me to the chair by the window when I asked. She did it without comment, which was a mercy. The window faced the back garden, and it was February, and Dorothea stood stripped against a gray Springfield sky, no amber now, no summer fullness, just the bare structure of what she was, every branch visible, the whole architecture of her exposed. She had looked like that when I arrived 3 years ago. January, the garden dead, the tree skeletal and enormous and entirely herself. I looked at her for a long time. Isadora spoke to him in the hallway, quiet, direct, the conversation of two people with a long history of difficult exchanges. Then her footsteps moved away down the hall, and the front door opened and closed, and the house was quiet again, and the silence outside the parlor door was back. He stood in the doorway. He did not come in. He put one hand on the frame, the left one, The one I had watched clench and release over 3 years and a half second between the music stopping and his composure returning, and he stood there the way a man stands when he has rehearsed what he wants to say and arrived at the door having forgotten all of it.
I didn't know, he said.
The words came out stripped. No precision to them. No the measured delivery of a man accustomed to his own authority. Just the plain statement, offered without defense, which was the most honest thing he had said in 3 years of occupation. I looked at Dorothea. You didn't ask, I said. The space between those two sentences was long enough to stand in. Long enough for everything that had been unsaid over 3 years to occupy it. The pencil marks on the sheet music, the 2-minute intervals, the bathroom floor and the cold sink, the tray outside the door with the tea at the right temperature, the wrong name said twice with urgency in an empty room. He stayed in the doorway. He asked what I needed. He asked what I was owed. He asked whether I wanted to leave, and when he asked that last one, his hand on the doorframe tightened, and I noticed, and I filed nothing away because I was done filing things away. I did not answer all of it. There were questions in that list that required more breath than I currently had, and more time than the moment could hold, and more honesty than either of us had yet built the foundation for. I answered one. I want a window that opens. He crossed to it before I finished the sentence. No hesitation. The latch turned and the window swung out and February came in, clean and cold, and carrying the smell of bare ground and distant wood smoke from somewhere down Carpenter Street, the ordinary winter smell of a city going about its business. It moved across my face, into my lungs. I breathed all the way down, both hands resting in my lap, not moving, not mapping measures or planning intervals or calculating how much I had left and how far it needed to stretch. Just resting, still, the way hands rest when they are not required to be anything other than what they are. I thought about the word pulse, the nocturne's name, the sound he had heard in my chest when everything else went quiet, the thing his aura acoustics had turned toward when I could no longer give him anything else, the last signal in a room gone dark. He had spent 3 years listening to what my hands made. In the end, it was what my body kept doing without my permission that finally made him hear me. He learned my name from my heartbeat. There are worse ways to be known. I was not healed.
He was not changed.
What stretched between us was not forgiveness, and it was not a beginning. It was something harder and more durable than either of those, the thing that exists when two people have run out of the comfortable fictions and are standing in the same truth for the first time. The arrangement was not over. It was renegotiated, starting here, starting with an open window and a name said correctly and the acknowledgement of a cost that had been accumulating for 3 years without a ledger. I would play again. I knew that already, sitting in that chair with February on my face. Not 18 hours. Not with my hands chained to a tempo set by someone else's impatience. On my terms, in whatever light the north-facing parlor could be persuaded to let in, with the window open so the air moved and my lungs remembered they had options. Later, when I was steadier, I went to the piano and rested my fingers on the keys. Not playing, just touching, feeling the give of them, the familiar resistance, the instrument that had held 3 years of my breath inside its strings. Outside, Springfield was quiet, the old Capitol dome somewhere in the distance. Dorothea bare and visible and entirely herself against the winter sky. Somewhere in the city, other women were sitting with their own calculations, the math of what they were worth, what they were owed, what it would cost to stop, and what it would cost to continue. I thought about them the way you think about people you have never met but recognize completely. I hope someone opened their window. If something in this story reached you, if you recognize the cost of being useful to someone who never learned your name, you are not alone in that. There are others. Women who found their way to these stories, who come back not for distraction, but because something here sees them. Subscribe so these stories find you when you need them. They'll be here.